Okay, and again, welcome, and I am going to go ahead and turn over the session straight away to Jodi Hanelt to introduce the topic and the presenters.
Thank you so much, Andy. Do I have the ability to share my screen? Good morning, everyone.
You should be able to show, yeah.
Thank you. I do. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Spring Immigration Workshop. And I am here with Makiko Wada, who is an advisor to international scholars at the MIT ISCO office, and Abe Schafermeyer, who is the director of the Office of International Students and Scholars at UNH. And we are going to talk about J-1 scholar institutional policies. First, housekeeping. We ask that you, if you feel comfortable, provide your first name on your Zoom screen, institution, and department, if it all fits. Please turn on your video. We'd like to see your faces, especially if we have time for question and answer at the end. It would be great to also be able to see your faces. But we understand that there can be Zoom fatigue, and turning off your video is okay too. Please know that while this is recorded, it is my understanding that your faces aren't visible, just the faces of the presenters. Andy, could you confirm that?
That's correct. Only the presentation itself and the presenters will be visible.
Thank you so much. Also, it's important, as we all know, to mute yourself and make sure that you make use of the chat function so that we can connect. And we'll have a section at the end for question and answer. It's okay to put it in the chat as the questions occur to you. And then we'll leave time at the end to make sure we either address your question or we set it aside and a team member can respond after the event. I now realize I need something to drink, and I'm sorry, I'll be right back. Thank you. Okay, so this is a summary of the policies that we're going to present. We are going to talk about just really a potpourri of issues that come up when we're advising on J-1 scholars. And we thought that by hearing the approach of three institutions, one that is small, well, let's see, one that has a relatively small caseload of scholars, both J and H, that's Brandeis. One that's constantly drinking from a fire hose, that would be MIT ISCO. And finally, UNH, which is a public institution. It's probably has fewer scholars than ISCO than MIT would, but also just the perspective of a public institution sometimes brings something else to bear. And also just to welcome Abe Schafermeyer, who's now a member of Region 11 after moving from Oregon. So we really feel fortunate to have Abe with us, and both today and just long term. Okay, so these are the topics that we're going to discuss. I won't enunciate them one by one. Okay, so the first one I'm going to pass over to Makiko, and she's going to introduce the topic, and then we'll each comment.
Thank you, Jodi. So the first topic is J-1 Research Scholar Qualifications. According to NAFTA Advisor's Manual, research scholar categories may be used for individuals to participate in their exchange visitor programs in those categories to engage in activities that further the objectives stated in 22 CFR 62.4 E or F, and that are compatible with those activities. MIT's requirement qualification for J-1 scholars are at least the minimum degree requirement is a PhD or PhD equivalent. And for some collegial level researchers who have a master's degree plus 2 years experience, or bachelor's plus 5 years of progressive research experiences or teaching experiences. And I think Jodi and Abe, they have different criteria for this category.
Yes,
Abe?
that's true. Go ahead, Abe.
Yeah, so at UNH, we don't require a PhD. We require just a bachelor's degree to participate in this category. I think that, you know, we do see a number of departments that want to bring students that are graduate level students to participate. And so it works for those programs. We've run into one snafu recently where we had some students coming to serve as teaching assistants, and it was unclear if they had a bachelor's degree or not. And so it can get messy sometimes, but as an institution, we do just have a bachelor's degree requirement to participate as a JA scholar, research scholar.
Thank you. And the same is true at Brandeis. Anyone who didn't have a bachelor's degree yet, we would suggest the intern category, which we will talk about later on. And so we also make sure that a role will not be considered a staff role or a permanent role because it would not be in the spirit of exchange visitor concepts. For J1 exchange visitor concept is established by the US Department of State. And so we do have a vetting system to make sure that that's not the case.
And that's a good segment for the next slide, which is typical appointment titles and why. For MIT, because we require PhD minimum and the positions needs to be after PhD, such as postdoc, associate fellows, and lecturer, visiting scholars, professors, and other schools has other requirement. But for postdoc associate needs to be paid appointment at MIT, and MIT goes with NIH payment guideline for postdoc minimum requirements, funding-wise. So MIT has to pay at least that much amount. And if anyone has a fellowship from overseas or from through MIT, they also need to meet at least that amount. MIT postdocs appointment are up to 4 years and plus possibility of 5th year extension. But beyond that point, MIT does not allow any postdoc title appointment. And visitors, visiting scholars, visiting scientists appointment, they also require PhD and sometimes exceptions for master's plus 2 or bachelor's plus 5. But MIT implemented the minimum funding requirement as well for visiting titles, and they have to meet or be supplemented for us to issue J document. MIT does not sponsor any positions. I mean, at least our office do not sponsor any visas for students, any tech positions or administrative or library positions, because our J is for researchers and teachers. Just so you know, anyone who does not know MIT International Systems, there is an International Scholars Office where I belong to. We handle visas for postdoc or above positions. And there's MIT International Students Office. They handle all the student-related documents, FMJs. Abe, would you like to go explain your policies?
Yeah, sure. So I always find it interesting to think about how an institution titles their positions. So in working with human resources, right, you have these different classifications of employments. And it's not always easy to mesh, right, what HR calls a position with how you want to bring someone. And I think Jodi alluded to a challenge in the previous slide that's real, right? So a J position is not supposed to be a permanent institutional position, right? That brings with it a lot of challenges. It should be, you know, a temporary experience that fits in with the goals and the purpose of the J program. So when you're trying to use a classification that's determined by your human resources office to fill this, it's important to kind of think about those things. I have been in situations in the past where, human resources classified something as in a way that makes it look institutionally like a real full-time position. And then issues come into play with respect to benefits and retirement contributions and things like this. And that can get really problematic if you're putting yourself in a position where you have to eventually pay out retirement benefits to a visiting J. So yeah, that's problematic. But at UNH, we have some similar categories of titles: visiting lecturer, postdoc. Obviously, we bring on J's, visiting professor. So those are kind of the typical appointment titles that we have at UNH that fit into this category. We're in this shop, we do students and scholars, so we're not separated like Makiko is. So we handle the J student category. Obviously, that's kind of a different topic. But yeah, Jodi.
Sure. Let's see, I probably should say here when I mentioned the appointment titles and why, when I say professor, I really mean what Abe is saying, which is visiting professor. As we know, it's prohibited to support a J1 professor if they are on a tenure track. And so in the scholar area, we would not allow that unless we knew it was a visiting professor role that the person had a place to go to. Another thing I think Makiko had mentioned is that in order for MIT to sponsor a J1 visiting scholar, they must also demonstrate that they have employment or an appointment in the home institution. That's not something that Brandeis would scrutinize. And if they had funding, if they have personal funding or say they earned funding from a government agency, it's more typical that a scholar, of course, would have an appointment at home, but it's not necessarily something that would stop us from inviting an exchange visitor on the research scholar or professor category. Let's see, I think those are a couple of the things they wanted to say. And then also, I think all institutions struggle with estimate of living expenses and how that factors into inviting professors, especially the research scholars. That I think that when I look around, it seems like we're all kind of within a band of maybe 6,000 or 7,000 difference. It seems like, and all of it's frankly fairly low, right? So I think, Makiko, could you correct me if I say the wrong number, but I believe that the minimum funding for a research scholar at MIT is around 35,000, is that right?
For visitors, yes, 35 is minimum just for primary, and plus 5,000 each for additional independent dependents.
Right. And Brandeis is lower than that, but it has like a higher amount for dependents. And so I think you and I are about 6,000 off. It's a hard thing to implement a way to constantly update that number year after year. I don't know if MIT or UNH has come across a way to do that, or if you're really focusing on that. It's something that Brandeis has to do a better job of. It's been something in the rearview mirror for a while, especially when we've had such a decrease in the number of J1 scholars visiting us over the past 2 years. But it is coming up, and we all know that cost of living in Massachusetts specifically is very, very high. So these numbers for Brandeis are I don't believe are high enough right now, and we're going to look to benchmark and change them. Abe, do you want to say anything about how you determine funding if you renew it year after year, or what do you do?
Yeah, so we, as far as the funding goes and living expenses, we try to tie our living expenses estimate to what the institution as a whole declares as kind of the living expenditures that people can anticipate, to try to be consistent. You're right, though, the last couple of years, right, with inflation, with the lack of scholars coming, it's definitely challenging. So prices are going up everywhere, including in rural seaside New Hampshire. So I think it's worth another look. Again, I think there's some value in consistency. So, you can use estimated living expenses for lots of different reasons on a campus. So I find it's been valuable for me in the past to tie our estimate of living expenses to other uses, right? The Office of Financial Aid, for example, what's published on your website. So I find that to be really beneficial. But I think you're right that it needs another look. It hasn't been updated, I don't think, in the way that it needs to be. And I do find, we all find that when scholars end up on campus and they find the reality of how much it costs to live and participate in their program, there's sometimes some sticker shock there. And then we have to come into play and try to find solutions, or try to at least meet with the individual and try to decide. But yeah, we also have add-on prices for dependents. It sounds like in the ballpark. I can't remember the exact number, but right, we have the basic living expense and then add-on for anticipated expenditures for dependents.
Thanks.
Yeah, MIT, we reevaluated the cost of living back in 2015, and yes, we are due too.
Can you tell how busy we've been these past 3 years that none of us has really updated anything? Yeah, and it's only fair to the scholar to remove some of that sticker shock or express that this living expense is assuming that you are sharing a living space and not an independent living space for you and your family, for example. Like those are things we could easily say. But so thank you for those comments. I appreciate it.
The next slide is out-of-country function. According to NAFTA Advisor's Manual, the out-of-country functionality in CVS allows RO/ARO to process. Hold on.
You okay?
Yes, I'm okay. I just lost it. To indicate that the professors or research scholar participating in his or her exchange program for a particular period of time outside of the United States, the record remains in active CVS status during that period. Usage of this out-of-country functionality is at the discretion of the program sponsor. So a lot of places do not utilize this functionality because it's not really a regulatory requirement. However, MIT uses it time to time occasionally when it's necessary. But the purpose has to be always for MIT. Sometimes MIT faculty member sends a postdocs over to, let's say, Switzerland. There's a facility, and asks them to do experiments, get the data, and come back. Or sometimes they send the postdocs to Singapore to exchange with their postdocs in Singapore. For those MIT-related activities and for the period of an extended period of time, which is usually, for our consideration, 8 weeks or longer, we make sure to notate this to this activity outside the US. And sometimes this helps the CDP when they come back to the US after being away from the US on an active J status for, let's say, 3 months. There's a notation that the officer can see at the border, and hopefully it's a smooth return. During the time they are away from MIT physically, they still have to maintain their MIT terms of appointment, such title, percentage effort, and funding salary if they're paid by MIT. Abe, do you utilize this functionality?
Yeah, so I think we have some similar parameters at the University of New Hampshire. This isn't a super common occurrence to go in and notate this for us. In my experience, I see this happen when a J scholar has some out of US research responsibility. But like Makiko said, it's directly related to their J program. They just need to be doing it outside of the US. And so we have used it in that, but again, it's not super common. I think one of the challenges that I've seen is, simply knowing that your J scholars sometimes are traveling for an extended period of time. So, it's wishful thinking that they're always going to check in with the office and say, here's what I'm going to do, and here's how long I'm going to go. And this is, I want to prove to you that it's directly related, and I'm going to keep the terms of my appointment, up to snuff. But so I think that's a challenge, right? Is trying to reach out to departments, make sure that your office and the value that you bring to their departments is known, so that you're a place that they know that they can go to get answers. Like Makiko said, when they come into contact with CBP, right, after they come back, far too many times have I gotten a phone call about someone rather than in advance, making sure that things are taken care of in a way that lines up. So I think that's one of the big challenges, is just making sure that they know that that if they're going to be gone for a substantial period of time, that checking in with your office is a really important thing to do. But the other parameters that Makiko laid out are very similar. Again, I just think we don't see this too often. And over the past couple of years, of course, with a significant decrease in new scholars coming, I think we've utilized this function even less.
Sure. And for Brandeis, I would echo the same. We have had one scholar who's had an exceedingly difficult time coming back into the country because of his country of citizenship and COVID restrictions. Both things have conspired against that individual. The person has been in, I think, 3 different countries trying to establish a way to get back with a renewed J-1 visa. All the while has been providing services to Brandeis in the role as Makiko described, has to be whatever they originally had agreed to. So they're still doing the thing that they're very talented to do, but they have to do it remotely. And as I mentioned, they've been doing it from a couple of different countries. We have elected not to mark it out of country because it feels more travel related and just general travel emergency linked. And so right now I think we're close, but now there's a spouse involved and the spouse has trouble acquiring a visa. And so we're hopeful that the person will return. It's actually helpful for you to mention that explaining this to CBP when they do arrive at the border might be especially tricky. So we'd want to spend some time with that individual and the dependent just to be sure that they're prepared to come back, and maybe a phone number and a letter of support explaining what's happened might be useful for that individual. Okay. Transfer policies. This one's mine. All right. So for transfer policies, we're usually in touch, right? Whenever we have an individual who we're going to share or that's going to another institution, we always take pause, I suppose, to see what department the individual is going to and whether it seems like it's consistent and is within the objective for which the person was originally admitted. And so we recently had a case where someone was in our chemistry department, and then when they wanted to transfer to another institution, they were going to work in radiology. And I had to educate myself and ask that new receiving institution to just educate me on why this isn't a change in objective. And once we have that information, we pass it right over. More often than not, it isn't any question about whether or not they're maintaining the same objective. For us, because we're such a smaller scale, I think Makiko will speak about the case for ISCO, but for our office, it's often that we will get a request within a couple of weeks. Sometimes it's a long time, right? Because they get an appointment letter and it's a month in advance and I'm traveling here. But sometimes it's not that far in advance. And because of our lower volume, we tend to accommodate those requests. I wonder, Makiko, would you like to comment on transfer policies and processes for MIT?
Right. So for MIT, we require minimum 30-day processing period. And that's partly because we need to get information from the department, and the same as Jodi, and probably Abe too, we need to contact the other institution to make sure that the J-1 classification or the field of research is continue to be the same objectives. We also consider how much time left on a J-1 research scholar or professor category. And if it's for years, great. If it's only for a month, we'll think about it. We don't mean that we don't do transfer, but we know, other visa sponsorship question is on the right. So we will think what the best course of action for this individual. But that's why we require 30 days process and preferably 60 days sometimes. And going back to the same objectives topics, and sometimes like Jodi, we had a case for someone coming to computer science field, but the current program at elsewhere was agriculture. So we really have to educate ourselves, like why agriculture and computer science are so close. And then eventually we had to ask the faculty member at MIT to write a letter. This individual is doing this research at this institution. this person's coming to my lab doing this research, and these are directly related objectives. And then we agree to accept that record, that postdoc. So sometimes we need to learn what's happening in the world, how agriculture and computer science are so close to each other. Aid?
Yeah, I think, when it comes to J transfer policies, I think this is one of the, the few times that we interact with each other as colleagues, right? So it does take some time to be able to assess the situation, understand who wants to come to you, where they want to come from, what they've been doing, what they're going to be doing, and try to make sure that's all lined up, and then have a good working relationship with the other scholar office to make sure that things are timely. We at UNH, we don't have a prescribed minimum time frame, and I think like Jodi, our volume isn't so big that we really have to. And in addition to that, there definitely have been situations where a dean comes to me and says Monday, right? And so, it's hard for me to say, no, Dean, as the director of OISS, I have absolutely no leverage, but I'm going to tell you no. So, I think it's challenging. So again, kind of outreach and communication and education to your departments in advance, I think does wonders to try to make sure that they understand the obstacles that you face and sort of the real work that you have to go through to make sure that a transfer can happen in the right way. So yeah, we don't have a minimum time frame. One other thing that Makiko mentioned that I think is interesting to think about is what is the International Scholar Office's role in determining the likeness of the objective from the sending institution to the home institution, and I think it's worth thinking about sort of who makes that decision and how that decision is made, right? Because I'm a student affairs guy, right? I have no ability to judge space science research and the likely compatibility of someone else's institution to my institution. So one thing I tend to do is I really tend to push this on to the academic units to be able to articulate that this is related research, that this is a related objective. And we have a document that they sign in being, the faculty and department sponsor for this. So I think that is reassuring to me so that I don't have to be an expert in every discipline that exists on not only my campus, but on some different campus that I may have never set foot on. So I think it's just an interesting thing for us to think about that role, about who makes that determination, how it's made, and then how as an institution you're able to justify the decision that you've made. So I think that's something that I think about a bit. Yeah.
I bet the US government is really reassured to know exactly how much we all spend thinking about this. And that, we're doing it in a very methodical way. We're doing it in a way that documents our decisions so that if there ever were a question or you were under an audit and someone really wanted to know why someone from chemistry ended up in a radiology department at another institution, that you've done your due diligence. And so this is definitely a much finer point. And I think probably we're all, as long as we're making the appropriate inquiries and documenting things in a way that's clear for anyone who examines the decision, I think we're in good shape. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, good. So sites of activity, I think this is me, right, Jodi?
Yes, go for it.
Okay, great. So, as we know, being designated as a J program allows you to, have your principal, physical area where your scholars are going to be housed, but it also allows you to articulate off-campus sites or other locations where your researchers are working. So, I think one interesting thing that's happening now at UNH that I can bring in here is that for quite some time, we have a law school that's located in Concord, the Franklin Pierce Law School, which was independent for a number of years, which has recently been absorbed into the University of New Hampshire system, right? So for forever and a day, it had its own designation for J program, right? So there were there were 2 ROs, right? And so when the merger happened, and when I came on board, we're moving through the process of no longer having 2 distinct designations, but instead to have a site of activity listed for our law program. The volume again is really small, but they do bring an occasional, visiting scholar to the law school in Concord. So I think it's good for folks to think, especially bigger campuses that have branch campuses, campuses that have research facilities, right? I know there are specific facilities related to the ocean work. There's specific facilities that each campus owns in different places. So it's a good activity, I think, to think through the concept of a site activity for your J designation, and to kind of really make sure that it's intentional, that you know what you have articulated through your designation and where you're saying your scholars are working. So because theoretically it should be articulated where physically your scholars are when they're doing their scholarly activity. So you shouldn't just put your home institution if really they're actually doing the majority of their work at a different geographic site. Yeah, so I'm sure MIT deals with this in a pretty significant way. Makiko, what do you think of the site of activity?
Yes, for MIT only has 1 campus, which is a main campus. So we put MIT as a main primary site of activity for all J1 cases. But MIT also collaborates with hospitals for cancer research, brain research, and for those hospitals, we do add site of activity so the scholar can go there to conduct experiments, not any physical doctor activities, but then come back to get data and come back to MIT, so that we do add a second site of activities for those areas constantly. But MIT, again, these activities has to be for MIT purposes, and MIT is still their home. What about you, Jodi?
Sure. Again, I wouldn't say we do it too much. There was an interesting case that we had to puzzle through a couple of years ago. Yeah, more than 2 years ago now, where an individual was being sponsored as a research scholar, and the professor who had invited the scholar had a dual appointment at a national lab outside of Massachusetts, and they wanted the individual to do work in that lab, but still be sponsored by Brandeis. And for reasons I can't remember, that lab either didn't have a J1 program, which I don't think is true, or for some reason, because of the work that the individual was doing, they didn't think that it should be their research scholar. And so we put those primary site as that lab, that national lab, and made note of the fact that the person is going to be doing that research. But we really hounded the faculty member to promise to visit often, for lack of better phrasing. And we did document the fact that this was a constant commuter situation where while the individual would not come to the Waltham campus here at Brandeis, that the faculty member frequently visited that lab and provided direct supervision over the research scholar.
I'll add one more quick thing that I'm just remembering that has been kind of can get messy, and that is, if you have a site of activity that's outside of your home state, then you've got to think taxation related issues can come into play. So depending if it's a resident for tax purposes, non-resident for tax purposes, not to get into a whole different area of substantial presence and messiness, but I know that over the pandemic, we did have someone doing some research out of state, and it did get messy quickly thinking about, how to assess tax rates on those individuals. So that's another variable I think that can come into play, and just be prepared to quickly deploy I'm not a tax lawyer, please seek out a tax lawyer if you have any questions about this. But, you're not going to be very popular if you just you know, if you don't answer the email, or if you just do a cold referral to TurboTax. So you have to, you have to speak somewhat intelligently about at least the variables that this individual could face, especially if they're choosing, right? If they're advocating for one side of activity over another, just so that they have all of the information so that they can think through this to the best of their ability.
Yeah, I think we're all tired of sites of activity and acknowledging them, whether it's in the J or H sphere, right? After 2 years of everyone relocating and now hopefully coming back to campus and not doing all their work in private homes and in other states or in other countries. We're just thankful that most of that is now coming back, at least at Brandeis, most of it's coming back because it has been a headache on what to do for those reasons. And I remember our financial office finally had to decide what they would say for both the people who are out of state, those who are out of country, who's allowed, who's not, and what the kind of the dates for permission for those things would be. Yeah, that was a big issue 18 months ago.
Same for MIT.
Change of category. This was a fun one that Brandeis had to do, I think, 3 times in the end, in the past 18 or so months. It happened, I think, exclusively in the, well, I think it actually went both ways. Sometimes it was scholar to student, and sometimes it was student to scholar. I'll give one example, and that was an individual who'd been working as a research scholar and wanted to change, had been working, I think, on AT, I think that's what it was, academic training, as a student, and then had accepted a role, honestly had accepted a, well, anyway, I'll just say, I had accepted a role as a research scholar at Brandeis, and the travel restrictions made it hard for her to go home. And so we had to learn this system for the first time. And probably the hardest part about it, and you guys can comment, was paying that $367 to the Department of State to get it done. So that pay.gov thing is hard. But shockingly, or I shouldn't say so, because a lot of times the Department of State is quite attentive to the needs of exchange visitor hosts. Within a very short time period, and I think the first 2 cases, we got an approval. And it was an approval with reasonable dates and really no back and forth or inquiry as to why. I think probably because we followed the instructions in the NAFSA manual and made sure we included all the explanations for why the person couldn't travel and why this was still a continuation of objectives. And so it was successful. There was one, no, actually, they were successful, but then the part that was hard was there was an extension case. That was the one that didn't go as well. But it isn't related to change of category, so I won't mention it here, but it also required $367 that the government gave back to us because they didn't execute the request before the person left the country. So I wonder, does anyone else want to talk about change of category? Makiko, you want to start?
Sure. MIT does not do this often, or never. We never did anything like this, but for the past 18 months, like Jodi said, people had difficulty traveling, and we requested for a research scholar to short-term scholar category, just a handful of cases. And I think most of them got approval. But like Jodi said, extension that might have been canceled or wasn't approved. But I think nowadays everyone can travel more freely than 2 years ago. So I don't think we'll pursue this anymore. What about you, Abe?
Yeah, when I think about just the words change of category, sort of I feel like I was trained as a young professional to just have my red flags go up and just sort of say, change of category, messy, complicated, try to find a different way to accomplish the same goal. I think it was ingrained in me a long time ago to try to avoid this at all costs. And I think I did for a long time. So just, presenting other options, finding other ways for people to do this. But as Makiko mentioned, right, the past couple of years with the challenges of traveling, with the challenges of staying, with the challenges of going, there have been more. And, surprisingly, it hasn't been as messy as maybe I trained myself to think it was going to be. So either that, or I'm just more comfortable with ambiguity than I was as a young professional. I don't know. But so yeah, it's rare. I think it's still rare. And I think as travel comes back and whatnot, I think we'll see it continue to be not a really common occurrence. But I still I default to the situation of, you know, is this really the pathway we need to go forward with? Is there another way to accomplish the same goal? And most of the time there has been, and sometimes there isn't. And just look at the manual, talk to your colleagues, know how to move forward. And that payment is one of the largest obstacles that I've come into contact with as well.
Thank you. Yes, I think as a general statement, DSOs and ROs and AROs were really taught to, well, in some ways, reject ambiguity or improvisation when at all possible. And now that's not our job anymore. It's to do both of those things with enthusiasm. And so welcome to the new world. And it's good. It comes, I suppose, professionally for me, right at the time that perhaps things would have become too rote and predictable. And now we have all this new stuff to deal with. So maybe it's a good thing. The fact that we're exploring the flexibilities and what the regs do and don't say, and what as a professional group we can come to an agreement on, or why we can see one institution interpreting something quite differently than another.
Yeah.
All right.
So in terms of trainees, yeah. So this is a topic that that I feel relatively close to. I have some experience in the past about really using this category in an innovative way and trying to create a revenue stream for my units, right? So there's this category that's really interesting where, you know, the CFR is outlined there. So I think as I can think of this from kind of a leadership component, and then I can think of it from an on the ground perspective. You know, from a leadership component, this offers some interesting pathways to get individuals onto your campus and engaged in different units across your campus. And again, you know, there are ways that you can build in program participation fees and things like this in order to try to really generate some revenue, if that's, you know, your charge or if that's your interest. On the ground, right, as a practitioner, I think to set one of these things up, it really, you have to have an administrative unit within the hosting department that has some dedicated resources to this. So I wouldn't recommend that the international office try to set up and run a large scale intern and trainee program unless you're well resourced as your international office and you have some extra FTE lying around, which I'm sure most of us on this call have tons of extra FTE lying around in our offices underutilized. But in my experience, if you do have a host department that has some ability to really be collaborate on an initiative like this, it can be a really interesting way to get some J's onto your campus and involved in your programs. But again, my general caution is that it's labor intensive to create these training plans, to monitor these training plans. The regulatory requirements of hosting these is more labor intensive with paperwork. So read through it and think through it before you move forward. But there are some good examples out there of some campuses that are doing this on larger scales. So yeah, I think it's sometimes not looked at. It's sometimes kind of, you know, a part of the J program that a lot of campuses don't entertain the idea of going in this direction. But it's out there and it can be useful in some situations, I think. But tread carefully with the amount of administrative work that you are willing to take on within your own unit.
Those are all great comments, Abe. Thanks. Yeah. I think that what we found, first of all, is that since they're usually undergrads, it can be tricky to describe the ways that a host department needs to substitute some of the services that a dean of students office might provide if the student were an enrolled undergrad. So the student doesn't have access to housing. They don't necessarily have access to lots of extracurriculars. They're not permitted to join clubs, that kind of thing. It's just not part of what what the intern category, it would, the dean of students wouldn't really recognize them as students. And so they might face a crisis, or they might have an interest in, and as I mentioned, joining clubs that would be common for their peers, but they don't pay the student activity fee and they're not enrolled and they're hard to recognize. And so when this happens, meaning when we see an intern coming, we really try to put out front that you need to make that department the intern's family for the host. And it's not just the PI, but what do you have for graduate students? Which undergrads are also in that community? How long will the visit happen? Where will they live? How much will it cost? Is there a housing stipend, or what will happen? So that's one thing that I thought has been a little difficult, but I think that a lot of departments have rallied. The other thing that I find really interesting and rewarding is that the departments, as much as the 7002, which is the agreements, right, for the training plans, as much as it's onerous and the signature sequence can be annoying and who's really looking, the thing that comes out of it most for me is that when the PI realizes what they have to write to make the plan, they actually find it really helpful. And they say this is a way for them to focus and make it exactly what the Department of State wants it to be, a rewarding experience for both the host institution and the exchange visitor. So I see that as a real positive. I've seen PIs even use that as just outside of the J-1 intern context as a training plan when needed. So I think it's really valuable. Just that the fact that the fact that it is so structured is a real value for our institution. And we don't use the idea of Brandeis charging for anything immigration-wise, it just wouldn't work at our institution. This is culturally different from other institutions, but we would never charge an intern or be able to use that as a revenue stream at Brandeis. But that's another point, that some institutions are centrally funded and reasonably so, which is why I would say that it's okay that we don't charge extra for interns. But some institutions are not funded or only have a task of supporting students and scholars of a certain nature. And then when you add another category, there could be a reasonable argument for creating a revenue stream that goes directly to your department. It just depends on how your attitude towards your understanding of how you're funded, and whether you feel like you're being stretched too thin. Do you need an extra FTE? Could intern revenue really fund an FTE? Probably not, but depending how big it was. But so thanks for those comments. And I think we're going to let Makiko off the hook because that's a no-no, right? At MIT Scholars.
Well, if they're enrolled student, they go to student's office and they will be visiting student. So our office at least do not do any interns or trainees categories.
Thank you.
So we are actually past the time. So I'm gonna go very quickly. I will not read this, but basically our office do not advise anyone on this waiver of 212E or 212E related questions. However, we give instructions to the scholars. This is how you apply for waiver, and we do not advise. We do not look into any applications. Right now, waiver application is taking a really long time because they go through 3 different government agencies. So we contact our J-1 scholars a year or two ahead and say, if you plan to stay in the US, not necessarily at MIT, but if you look into the future from 5 years now, you might want to look into this waiver because it takes a long time for you to get approval. And unless they get approval, MIT cannot file. We don't tell that part to the scholars, but unless the scholar get the waiver of approval, we cannot apply for the following visas such as H-1B. So in a way, we initiate this conversation in the end, to help us file their H-1Bs if necessary. What about you, Jodi?
Sure. It's definitely linked to the H-1B process. We don't facilitate it really in any way. We give them links and say good luck. The only time we would engage, I forgot, Makiko, if you already mentioned that, would be if we thought there was a mistake. And so when they come in, we always examine the records, as I'm sure everyone does, looks at the visa, looks at the DS 2019, and make sure that, first of all, that the answer about 212E is consistent. And if it's not consistent, then we usually seek an advisory opinion, and that we try to orchestrate 100%. We write the letter, we get all the information from the scholar, we submit the documents. So we're very hands-on with that because we feel like that's an important service that really the institution can best provide.
Yeah, at UNH, it's a similar sort of situation. So the 212E, I wish we did a better job of communicating with folks so far in advance to make sure that they think of this, right? It's much more common to get somebody that has a more limited time frame and we find out is subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, and then it's a bit of a scramble. So I think the proactive nature that Makiko outlines can be really good for a campus. You'll be a lot more popular with your deans if you think about these things and try to get information out to your constituency as far enough in advance. And the time frame now is super long, so it takes a while. Yeah, we don't. Aside from that, we don't really get involved with it much at all, except for if there needs to be an advisory opinion for an error. So, and that happens. And again, if that happens, it's good to sit down with the individual and not just show them what the links are and then wave goodbye, right? But actually support them through the process, because that can be a pretty impactful mistake on individuals.
Thank you. There we go. Wait, I pressed the wrong button. Well, this is our last slide. Congratulations, everyone. And we have 10 minutes for just addressing any chats questions that come up. But all of us engage in some way in filing an annual report for the Department of State. I will say that I think that it depends on the kind of office you are. I can summarize here. It sounds like, Makiko, you guys submit your report. Actually, I'll let you speak for yourself. But for Brandeis ISSO, we have to submit a report that's joint for students and for scholars, right? Because I'm just the RO for the whole program. So it usually for Brandeis, it's about 14 pages long. That's inclusive of the document that CVIS generates for us and our narrative and making sure we go point by point on what's required in an annual report. We still do pictures and captions, and we still try to communicate that Brandeis is a vibrant place for international students and scholars, and that we try to maintain it as such and educate our students and scholars about the many opportunities. And we have a section on the Fulbright scholars and their club and what they do and when they gather. And so we try to go back to the spirit of why the J program exists in the first place. And in that way, we, in addition to being compliant, we're also communicating something back that it's truly valuable for us and for those who participate. Makiko, since I started to speak for you, I didn't mean to. Would you like to speak about the annual report at ISCO?
Sure. So we only report the scholar section, and we don't even get student questions. But Jodi said we get like 6 narrative questions, and it's about 2 pages per document. And they also generate a CVIS usage number, which are not necessarily truthful to what we have in our log. So we just say, yeah, the number is discrepancy, but this is the number. And our report is like 2 or 3 pages. We don't put any color print or flyer or anything. On the other hand, we do that for redesignations for J program. But for annual reports, ours is very simple. You, Abe?
Yeah, so annual reports, I think they run the spectrum, right, of people just doing, right, what you have to do, fill in the blanks, populate it, send it in, and then some people get really excited and create, a colorful, long document. And again, I think like Jodi said, it just depends on your institution. At UNH, we do the student and the scholar side, so it all comes from an office. So our length is similar to what Jodi's talking about. I think in my mind, right, I think the annual report can in some ways serve as advocacy to be able to communicate with the Department of State about the value of the J program. It's really distinct, the spirit of the J program compared to the other non-immigrant categories that we work with. So in some ways, I think it's worth doing a little bit extra and making this, making it, really sort of visually articulate the spirit of the J program. So at the same time, right, we've only got so many hours in a day. How many hours do you want to put into your J report? So I've seen the gambit, I guess, from really short, fill in the blank, nothing else, to, something that looks a bit more like a well-documented book report with color crayons and everything. And it's, no, I'm just kidding. So yeah, and here I would characterize what we do at UNH as somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. We have a couple of chats, a couple of questions. And so I wonder if we can turn our attention to those. There's been one invitation for individuals to share how your institution happens to determine how often you benchmark against other institutions for the minimum funding for J's. So I'm just going to invite people to put things in the chat rather than vocalize it here, because I think that's what Rachel has requested. So have people do that. There's another question about background checks. It's funny you would ask that question, and I can answer it and that other people can too. So for background checks, I think that's something that's going to only now start at Brandeis. Before, it was honestly, to my knowledge, the only ones I saw were actually our employees, because we have to do a background check for, I forgot if it's the J or the F program, but maybe it's both. In any event, we always have to do it when we get a new employee. But I think you're talking about more broadly on campus. And so I think that that's something that Brandeis is just now implementing for everyone who's a new employee, but wasn't true before. I wonder, Makiko and Abe, are you aware of what your HR offices do for background checks?
Yeah, so at UNH, it's outsourced. So we use HireRight as a background check. So a lot of our HR processes were recently kind of centralized. There was a big organizational change on campus. And so, yeah, it's outsourced for, in actuality, it's the entire New Hampshire system, right, that uses HireRight. So, and to the best of my knowledge, it's used only once at the time of hire for employees. Now the J issue is something else. So those folks, I see there's another question about export controls. So those individuals do go through an export control process at UNH, but they're not doing background checks right now through HireRight for J's. So that's something that is going to have to be addressed.
For MITs, I'm not aware any implementation of background check unless otherwise necessary areas like nuclear research area maybe, but we do not conduct anything.
Jodi, I think you're.
Thank you for the question. I think you might have started to include something about export controls, or maybe not, Abe, but there is a question in the chat about that. If someone can remind me of the major company that does it, we have a contract with that company. I forgot which one it is, and it only is like maybe a year and a half old. Thankfully, the ISSO is not involved in that contract, but my understanding is that the scholars that we hire that go through the Office of Research Administration all get pumped through there. Does anyone remember the name of the company? You can put it in the chat, whatever is the common one. Okay, maybe someone will put it. Let's see. No, thanks for Rebecca reminding me of it's the ROs. The background checks every 2 years. Thank you for that. Okay, another question. Are unpaid scholars still tracked by HR using a 0% appointment or something similar? Let's see. Makiko and Abe, Makiko, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, for MIT, when we sponsor J-1, they have to have 100% appointment. So they cannot be reduced appointment, and the HR always keep track on them, the appointment, and basically where the lab is. For WBs or B1s, sometimes not for the past 2 years, but sometimes they just pop up in the record, and then we are not aware of them existing on campus. We make sure that to contact the department to keep track on them. But there's no such 0% appointment at MIT.
Yeah, I'm still learning kind of the plumbing at UNH, right, through human resources and what these appointments are called and how they're moved through. But we do have unpaid scholars. and they're not in the system in the same way as an employee. So there's like a kind of a visiting scholar type category within Banner that's different. So I think that, you know, with my experience, that's how they're categorized. And I don't think in that categorization there has to be any FTE allotment articulated. So they don't look the same as employees in our system, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Someone did put one name of the company that I asked for, but I think it sounds, I don't remember the name Descartes, but yeah, it definitely was called Visual Compliance of Virginie. So thank you for sharing that. Let's see, there's some just active chat that's very helpful. I won't read out. Let's see if there are any more questions. A comment about HireRight is in there. So certainly the attendees are sharing lots of information, which is just what we want. And take note of anyone who happens to be sharing something if you want to follow up with them at a later time in addition to the presenters. I'm sure people like to share their processes. We're getting close to the end of our session, to the top of the hour. Yeah, it's just now 11:01. And so the last one, I'm going to invite Andy back to the stage and he can talk about getting involved in GRAC and SIW.
Okay, thank you, Jodi, Abe, and Makiko for a really great session today. So in conclusion, I just want to put a plug in for the Government Regulatory Affairs Committee, GRAC, which is a program overseen by NAFSA Region 11. And GRAC is responsible for organizing spring immigration workshops. So I hope that you've been able to attend other sessions or will be able to attend other sessions and have benefited from them. GRAC is a team that focuses on US government laws, rules, and regulations as they pertain to international students and scholars attending or visiting or working at higher education institutions. We are going to be putting out a call for new members in June, so please consider getting involved. Keep an eye out on your email. And once again, thank you for attending this morning's workshop.
Thanks to everyone.